From the moment he touched the piano keys as a young child, it was clear that music was more than just a hobby. It was his destiny. He had an instinctive connection to the instrument, as if the piano were an extension of his very being. The sound of the keys, whether it was a gentle melody or a storm of rapid notes, seemed to come naturally to him. It was as if the piano had always been waiting for him. Growing up in a modest household, there wasn't much to distract him. While most kids spent their afternoons outside running around with friends, he was captivated by the piano in the corner of the living room. His parents were supportive, but they didn't fully understand the extent of his gift. They did, however, recognize his love for music and encouraged him to explore it further. His mother would often tell him stories about famous musicians, and even though she wasn't a musician herself, she knew enough to see that her son's talent was extraordinary. When he was 5, his parents decided to seek out a piano teacher. They found an elderly woman who had taught music for many years. She was a strict but caring teacher, and she immediately saw that he was no ordinary student. He picked up new pieces quickly, and his playing was filled with an emotional depth that belied his age. Other students would struggle with certain pieces for weeks, but he would master them in a fraction of the time. By the time he was 10, his reputation as a piano prodigy began to spread. He started playing at local concerts, his performances leaving audiences in awe. But it wasn't just his technical skills that set him apart. It was the way he made music come alive. Every note seemed to have a purpose, every pause held meaning. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was telling a story with each piece, drawing the audience into his world. As he grew older, his passion for music intensified. He would spend hours each day practicing, learning new pieces, and perfecting his technique. Music was no longer just a hobby, it was his purpose. His mind was constantly filled with the melodies of Beethoven, Chopin, and Mozart. He would often dream of performing in grand concert halls, of hearing the applause and praise that came with playing at the highest level. At 16, his dream began to take shape. He was invited to perform at a prestigious music competition in a faraway city. It was the kind of event that could change a musician's career forever. The competition was fierce, with other pianists who had been playing for years, but he wasn't intimidated. He knew that he had something special, something that set him apart from the rest. He entered the competition with a sense of quiet confidence, and his performance stunned the judges. His fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, his interpretation of the piece so rich with emotion that it felt as though he had lived the music himself. He won the competition, and his career took off from there. He was soon performing in some of the most prestigious venues around the world, from the grand concert halls of Europe to the bustling theaters of New York City. His name was now synonymous with excellence. Critics praised his ability to combine flawless technique with raw emotion. Audiences flocked to see him perform, eager to witness the magic that only he could create. With each performance, his reputation grew. But as his fame spread, so did the pressure. The expectations were high, and he felt the weight of them every time he sat down at the piano. He wasn't just playing music anymore. He was playing for the approval of the world. He wanted to be perfect, not just for himself, but for everyone who watched him. It became a relentless pursuit. He rehearsed for hours, days sometimes, until he could play every note with precision. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was missing. He had everything he had ever dreamed of: fame, fortune, adoration. But music no longer brought him the same joy it once had. What had started as a passion was beginning to feel like a duty. He was no longer playing for the love of music. He was playing to meet the expectations of others. He would often find himself lying awake at night, thinking about his next performance, worrying whether it would be enough. Was he playing with enough emotion? Was he technically flawless? The pressure to always be perfect became overwhelming, and it started to take its toll on him. The joy of playing had been replaced by a constant anxiety, the fear that one mistake, one slip-up, could ruin everything he had worked for. It wasn't just his performances that were affected. His personal life began to suffer as well. He had little time for anything outside of music. Friends and family noticed that he had become more distant, more consumed by his art. He spent every waking moment either practicing or thinking about his next performance. His relationships became strained, and he found himself alone, surrounded only by the sound of the piano. Despite his inner turmoil, the world continued to praise him. He was the best, they said. No one could play like him. But he knew that something had changed. The excitement and passion he once felt for music had been replaced by a sense of emptiness. He was constantly chasing after perfection, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was slipping further away from him. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, he decided to take a walk to clear his mind. He wandered the streets aimlessly, not knowing where he was going until he found himself standing in front of a small, quiet cafe. It was an ordinary place, nothing like the grand venues he was used to. But there, sitting at the piano in the corner, was an elderly man, his fingers moving slowly over the keys. There was no audience, no spotlight, just the sound of the man playing a simple, heartfelt melody. The music was unlike anything he had ever heard before. It wasn't perfect, but there was something beautiful in its imperfection. The melody was raw, emotional, and it struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in years, he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. He watched the man play for a few more minutes before quietly leaving the cafe. As he walked back to his hotel, the melody stayed with him. It haunted him, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him question everything he had been chasing. What was music really about? Was it just about perfection, or was there something more to it? Little did he know that this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would change the course of his career, and his life, forever. The questions that had been simmering inside him began to grow louder, and the mysterious melody that had so deeply affected him would soon play a crucial role in his journey, one that would challenge his view of music and himself. The memory of the elderly man's piano performance lingered in his mind, haunting him in a way he didn't quite understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he had been missing all along, something that the man had captured with such ease. The melody was simple yet profound, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of connection to something beyond the pressure of perfection. It was the kind of music that came from the heart, not from technique. Back in his hotel room, he sat at his own piano, fingers resting lightly on the keys, but he couldn't bring himself to play. The weight of the expectation, the constant drive to be flawless, was still there. But now there was a crack in that facade. The man's music had shown him something different, something pure and uncalculated. He had spent years striving for perfection, but in that moment he realized how much he had sacrificed along the way. He wasn't just playing music. He was chasing an ideal. And in doing so, he had lost the very essence of what had first drawn him to the piano. For the next few days, he found himself thinking more and more about that melody. He couldn't get it out of his head. He even tried to play it on his own piano, but it was impossible. The melody was too simple, too raw, and yet too perfect in its simplicity. It was like a puzzle he couldn't solve, a mystery he couldn't unravel. He asked around the cafe where he had heard the man play, hoping to learn more about him, but no one seemed to know anything. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. He considered returning to the cafe, hoping for another chance to hear the melody again. But the thought of sitting in the same chair and listening to the same music felt too intrusive. Instead, he began to search for any trace of the mysterious musician, but nothing turned up. There were no records, no articles, no mention of a pianist who played like that. As the days passed, the frustration grew. The music was so close to him, yet it remained elusive, slipping through his fingers like sand. His obsession with it only deepened. He couldn't stop thinking about it, and in his mind it became a symbol of everything he had been missing in his own music. The perfection he had worked so hard to achieve now felt shallow and empty in comparison. It wasn't long before he realized that the pursuit of this melody had become an obsession. He began to feel as though he couldn't play any other music without hearing that same simple, raw melody echoing in his mind. Every piece he played, no matter how complex or technically demanding, seemed hollow. Nothing satisfied him. His performances began to feel disconnected, as if he were just going through the motions without any real purpose. His fans noticed the change. They could sense that something was different in his playing. The applause at his concerts was still loud, but it didn't feel as genuine. He had always been able to make the audience feel his music, but now it was as though they were applauding a ghost, a shell of the artist he had once been. He could see the look of disappointment in their eyes after each performance, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He was too consumed by the search for the melody that had captured his soul. His friends and colleagues began to worry. They noticed how much he had withdrawn from everything else in his life. He no longer attended social gatherings or spent time with his loved ones. His only focus was the music and not even his own. The more he searched for the melody, the more disconnected he became from the world around him. One evening, during a rare moment of quiet, he sat in his hotel room, staring out the window at the city lights below. He thought about all he had accomplished in his career. He had everything: fame, recognition, wealth, but none of it mattered anymore. It was as if the very thing that had brought him joy and purpose had lost its meaning. Music, once his greatest passion, now felt like a burden. In the silence, he realized that he had been so focused on the pursuit of perfection that he had forgotten why he had started playing in the first place. He had become trapped in a cycle of self-imposed expectations, always trying to be better, always pushing himself to meet impossible standards. But in doing so, he had lost touch with the one thing that had made him fall in love with music in the first place: the emotion, the vulnerability, the rawness that came with playing from the heart. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about the joy of playing without the need to prove anything. The pressure, the obsession, the constant drive for perfection, they had all built a wall around him, preventing him from experiencing the true freedom that music had once given him. The next morning, he decided to take a break from his rehearsals. He left his hotel room and wandered the streets of the city, hoping that a change of scenery might help him clear his mind. It was early and the streets were still quiet, the sun just beginning to rise. As he walked, he found himself at the edge of a small park. It was a peaceful spot, with benches beneath large trees and the sound of birds singing in the distance. He sat on one of the benches and closed his eyes, letting the quiet wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of calm. The pressure he had been carrying seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. In that moment, he realized that the music he had been searching for wasn't something that could be found. It wasn't a piece he could learn or master. It was a feeling, an experience. The melody that had captivated him was not just about the notes or the technique. It was about the emotion that it evoked. It was about allowing the music to flow freely, without fear of judgment, without the need to be perfect. He stood up and began walking again, this time with a sense of purpose. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. He didn't need to search for the perfect melody anymore. The music he had been looking for was already inside him. All he needed to do was let go of the need for control and allow the music to take him where it wanted to go. As he walked, he felt a renewed sense of inspiration. He wasn't just a pianist anymore. He was a musician, someone who could connect with the world through the language of music. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to be the best. He just needed to play. And in that moment, he realized that the pursuit of perfection had been his greatest obstacle all along. The true beauty of music lay in its ability to speak to the soul, to express feelings that words could never capture. He was no longer bound by the need to be flawless. He was free to play from his heart, to let the music flow without fear. With this new understanding, he felt a sense of peace settle within him. The pressure he had carried for so long seemed to lift, and he realized that the next chapter of his journey would not be about perfection. It would be about embracing the imperfections and finding the joy in the music once again. As the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. The sense of clarity he had felt in the park still lingered, but now there was a quiet doubt that followed him everywhere. He wasn't sure what had changed. Perhaps it was his realization about perfection, or the fact that he had allowed himself to let go of his obsessive need to be flawless. But somehow, despite his efforts, the music still felt incomplete. He still couldn't find that balance between his technical skill and the raw emotion that had once seemed so natural to him. It wasn't long before he realized that his new perspective on music wasn't as simple as he had hoped. The pressure to play with perfect emotion was replaced by the pressure to find a new sense of freedom in his playing. He had let go of his need for perfection, but now he had to find a way to express his emotions authentically without feeling like he was overcompensating. It was a delicate balance, a line he wasn't sure how to walk. He spent weeks in this limbo, uncertain of where to go next. His performances were still well received, but there was something missing. He knew it, and he could see it in the eyes of the audience. They applauded, but the applause felt less genuine, as though they were waiting for him to break through and deliver something even more powerful than before. The haunting melody still echoed in his mind, but it no longer served as an inspiration. Instead, it felt like a reminder of something that he had lost along the way. The doubt began to creep back in. What if he had made a mistake by letting go of his pursuit of perfection? What if the freedom he had sought was just an excuse for mediocrity? He had spent years perfecting his technique, becoming known as the best pianist in the world, and now he wasn't sure what he was anymore. His music felt disjointed, as though he was playing for the sake of playing, but without the deep purpose that had once driven him. He decided to take a break from his hectic schedule and retreat to a small cabin in the countryside. It was a place he had visited a few years ago, a peaceful spot far from the hustle and bustle of city life. The idea of being alone, surrounded by nature, seemed like the perfect way to clear his mind. Maybe, he thought, he just needed time to rediscover the joy of playing. When he arrived, the cabin was just as he remembered, simple, cozy, and quiet. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. He set up a piano in the small living room, a grand piano that had been placed there specifically for him. It was beautiful, its dark wood shining in the soft light that filtered through the windows. But as he sat down to play, he felt a deep sense of unease. The piano seemed foreign to him now, as if it had become something distant, something he no longer knew how to approach. He tried to play familiar pieces at first, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Chopin's Nocturne, but each note felt forced. It wasn't that he couldn't play the pieces. It was that they didn't bring him the comfort they once had. He realized that over the years, he had grown so accustomed to the technical side of music that he had forgotten how to truly feel it. The piano no longer spoke to him the way it had in his youth. He had trained himself to play with precision, but in doing so, he had lost the raw emotion that had once flowed so easily from his fingers. Frustrated, he walked away from the piano and stepped outside. The cool air of the countryside filled his lungs, and for a moment he just stood there, breathing in the stillness. The world around him was quiet, but in his mind, the noise was deafening. His thoughts raced. What was the point of it all? He had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. He had the adoration of the world, the respect of his peers. But now, in this quiet place, he felt as though he had nothing left to prove. He spent days in solitude, walking through the woods, staring at the stars, trying to find a way back to the music that had once been his lifeblood. But no matter how hard he tried, the connection seemed to slip further from him. It wasn't until one evening, as he walked along a trail near the cabin, that he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. The sound of a piano. It was distant, almost faint, but unmistakable. He turned and followed the sound, his heart beating faster with each step. It was a simple melody, just like the one he had heard in the cafe, but this time it wasn't just a fleeting sound, it was real. He found himself standing in front of a small, rustic cottage, the door slightly ajar. The music was coming from inside. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped inside. The room was warm, and an old woman sat at the piano, her hands moving gently over the keys. She was playing with a softness that was almost ethereal, her fingers gliding over the keys with an effortless grace. The music was unlike anything he had heard before. It was simple, yet it spoke to him in a way that nothing had in years. The melody was haunting, but not in a way that evoked sadness. It was the kind of music that made him feel both alive and at peace. He stood there for a few moments watching her play. It was as if the world had disappeared, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of his own doubts. The music was pure, untainted by expectation or the pressure to be perfect. It was just music, and it was enough. The woman finished the piece and looked up, noticing him standing in the doorway. She smiled warmly and motioned for him to come inside. "I didn't expect company," she said gently, her voice carrying the same calmness that had flowed through her music. "But it's always nice to share a little music," he smiled back, feeling an unexpected sense of comfort. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, not knowing what else to say. She nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Music is like that. It speaks to people in different ways. Some people chase it their whole lives, trying to make it perfect. But sometimes the most beautiful things are the simplest." Her words hit him like a wave. He realized in that moment that she was speaking to him directly, without even knowing who he was. He had been chasing after the wrong things. thinking that perfection was the key to success. But she had found something that he had lost, the ability to play from the heart without the need for validation or applause. "Would you like to play?" she asked, as if reading his mind. He hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to return to the piano, but something inside him told him to try. He sat down at the piano beside her, and for the first time in a long time he played not for the audience, not for perfection, but for himself. He played with a freedom he hadn't felt in years, allowing the music to flow without fear. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. As the last note lingered in the air, he felt a sense of peace settle within him. He had found what he had been searching for all along. The music wasn't about perfection. It was about expression, about feeling, about sharing a part of yourself with the world. And for the first time in a long time, he knew that he had found his way back to the music. The days that followed in the countryside cabin seemed to blend together. There was no rush, no deadlines, no pressure to perform. For the first time in years, he felt like he was living without a sense of constant expectation. The music he had once thought was lost to him was starting to return, but it wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, more meaningful. It was personal. Each day he would walk through the woods, reflecting on the moments that had shaped his life. He thought about his childhood, the joy he had felt when he first played the piano and the way music had come so naturally to him. Back then it had been about expressing himself, not about pleasing others. He had loved the sound of the notes, the way they connected to his emotions, the way they seemed to speak for him when words failed. But somewhere along the way, music had become about expectations, about being the best, about impressing the world. Now, in the quiet of the countryside, he was starting to reconnect with that simple joy. He wasn't trying to play like anyone else or live up to some image of perfection. He was just playing because it felt right. Every note he played, every chord he struck felt like a small victory, a reminder of the reason he had started playing in the first place. The elderly woman's music still echoed in his mind. It was the kind of music that didn't need to be perfect. It was raw, unpolished, but full of life. It was free. He realized that the true beauty of music was not in the technical mastery, but in the ability to convey an emotion, to let the music speak for you. The pursuit of perfection had led him down a path of constant stress, but now he saw that imperfection was a part of the beauty of life. He didn't have to be perfect to be heard. He just needed to be real. One afternoon, as he sat at the piano in the small cabin, he found himself playing a melody that felt familiar, yet different. It wasn't one of the grand pieces he had spent years perfecting. It was simple, a few notes strung together, but it felt like a conversation with himself. He let the music flow, not thinking about the audience or the critics, just allowing it to come from his heart. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about the performance or how others would perceive it. He was just playing for the sake of playing. As the final note faded, he sat there in silence, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. It was the same melody he had heard from the elderly woman, but now it was his. He realized that the music he had been searching for had never been some perfect piece, but rather the simple act of playing from the soul. He wasn't trying to replicate anyone else's music. He was creating his own. That evening, after his usual walk through the woods, he returned to the cabin and sat down to write. He had never thought of himself as a composer, but now the idea of creating his own music seemed natural. It felt like the next step in his journey. He took out a piece of paper and began to jot down the notes that had been swirling in his mind for days. The music poured out of him, not perfectly but honestly. Each note was a reflection of his journey, of everything he had learned over the years and the lessons he was still learning. It was messy, but it was beautiful. As the weeks went by, he continued to compose and the music became more personal. He stopped worrying about whether it was good enough or whether it would be appreciated. He just let it flow, trusting that the music would speak for itself. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He was simply expressing what was in his heart. Eventually, the time came for him to return to the city. He had spent enough time away from the world, and while the countryside had brought him peace, he knew it was time to face the music again, this time on his terms. He was no longer the same man who had left for the cabin. He was different now, more confident in himself and in his music. He wasn't worried about perfection. He just wanted to share his music with others. Back in the city, he prepared for his first concert since his time away. It was a small performance, nothing too grand, but it felt important to him. He had composed new pieces, pieces that reflected his journey, pieces that were raw and real. He knew that some of his audience might be disappointed. They had come to expect the perfect performances, the flawless technique, but he didn't care. This was his music, and he was ready to share it with the world. On the night of the performance, he walked out onto the stage, the spotlight shining down on him. The crowd was silent, waiting for him to begin. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then began to play. The music was simple, not the complicated show-stopping pieces he was known for, but something different. It was honest, and it was his. As his fingers moved across the keys, he could feel the music coming from deep inside him. He wasn't performing for the audience. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just playing for the sake of playing. As the final note faded into silence, he looked up. The audience was still. There was no applause at first, just a moment of quiet reflection. And then slowly the applause began. It wasn't the thunderous applause he was used to, but it was real. The audience had felt something. They had connected with his music in a way that was deeper than just technical perfection. After the performance, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He had done it. He had shared his music not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And in doing so, he had rediscovered the joy that music had once given him. As he walked off the stage, he realized that the journey he had been on wasn't just about finding a perfect melody or achieving flawless technique. It was about learning to play from the heart, to express the things that words couldn't. It was about embracing imperfection and finding beauty in the messy, unpredictable parts of life. The search for perfection had been a trap, but now he was free. The elderly woman's words echoed in his mind once again. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the simplest. He smiled, knowing that he had finally found that beauty. The music was no longer just something he did. It was a part of who he was. And as he walked into the night, the sounds of the city around him, he knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much music left to make, so many stories left to tell. But for now he was content, knowing that he had found his way back to the music that had once set him free. The days after the concert were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had returned to the stage not with the pressure to prove anything, but with a newfound freedom. The applause he received was warm, but it didn't feel like the validation he once sought. It was different now. It was about the connection he had made with the audience, not about being perfect. He had played for himself, and in doing so, he had found a peace he hadn't known was possible. Still, there was a part of him that knew he couldn't just stay in this place forever. The music had come to him in waves of inspiration during his time away, but the world around him was always changing. He couldn't ignore the feeling that he had only just scratched the surface of what he was capable of. There were still more stories to tell, more emotions to explore through his music. For the first time in a long while, he felt excited about the future. He didn't know exactly what it would look like, but he knew he didn't want to fall back into the same old routine. The journey he had taken had changed him. The perfection he had once strived for was no longer his goal. He wanted to create music that was raw, real, and vulnerable, music that reflected the ups and downs of life. He began to compose more, but this time, it was different. He didn't worry about whether the pieces would be well received or whether they would live up to the expectations of his past performances. He simply wrote what came to him, pouring his emotions into every note. Sometimes the pieces were chaotic. Other times they were simple, but each one was a reflection of his journey, his growth. He wasn't trying to show off his technical skill. He was showing his soul. The music he composed was unlike anything he had played before. It didn't fit into the traditional mold of classical piano, nor was it anything that the world might expect from him. It was a blend of everything he had learned and unlearned over the years. There were moments of intensity, where the notes were loud and sharp, reflecting the inner turmoil he had experienced. There were moments of stillness where the music seemed to hang in the air, leaving room for reflection and peace. And there were moments of joy, where the music danced with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. His compositions began to take shape, and soon he was planning his next performance. But this time he didn't want to perform in the grand concert halls he was accustomed to. He didn't want the formalities, the pressure, the expectations. Instead, he decided to take his music to a different kind of stage. He wanted to play in smaller, more intimate venues, where the connection between him and the audience was more personal. He didn't want to perform for the applause. He wanted to perform for the shared experience. The night of his next performance, he stepped into a small venue, a cozy room with soft lighting and an atmosphere of quiet anticipation. It was nothing like the grand concert halls he had once played in, but to him it felt just right. The audience was smaller, but the energy in the room was palpable. People had come not to see a famous pianist, but to hear someone who had something to say through his music. As he sat at the piano and began to play, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The nerves that had once consumed him before a performance were gone. He wasn't worried about whether he would be good enough. He was simply there to share his music, to connect with the people who had come to listen. The music flowed effortlessly. He played his new compositions, each one a part of his journey, a part of the person he had become. There were moments when the music swelled with emotion, and the audience seemed to hold their breath hanging on every note. And there were moments when the music softened, becoming quiet and introspective, as if it were speaking directly to each listener's heart. As he played, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: true joy. Not the joy of performing perfectly or impressing others, but the joy of expressing himself in a way that felt authentic and real. It wasn't about the technical mastery anymore. It was about the emotions, the connection, the shared experience between him and the audience. When the final note of the last piece faded into silence, he sat back, allowing the room to absorb the music. The applause came, but it wasn't the kind of applause he was used to. It wasn't thunderous or frantic. It was gentle, thoughtful, a quiet appreciation for what had been shared. And for the first time, he realized that this was enough. The applause didn't need to be loud or constant. The fact that the music had resonated with them was enough. He left the stage with a lightness in his heart, knowing that he had found a new path for his music. It wasn't the path of perfection, and it wasn't the path of fame and recognition. It was the path of truth, of vulnerability, of playing from the heart, and it was a path he was eager to continue exploring. Over the next few months, he continued to perform in smaller venues, playing to audiences who were there not just for the music, but for the experience of hearing someone who had found his own voice. He began to notice a shift in the way people responded to his music. It wasn't just about the notes anymore. It was about the story behind the music, the emotion that he poured into every performance. He started to receive letters from people who had attended his concerts. Some spoke of how his music had helped them through difficult times. Others spoke of how it had inspired them to reconnect with their own passions. He was moved by their words, but more than that, he realized that the music he had made wasn't just for him. It was for them too. It was a gift he had given, and in return he had received something far more valuable than any accolade or award: connection. One evening, as he sat in his small apartment after a performance, he thought back to where it all began. He remembered the pressure he had felt, the obsession with perfection that had driven him to the brink of exhaustion. He remembered the quiet moment in the cafe, when he had heard the elderly woman's simple melody, and how that had set him on a path of rediscovery. He remembered the isolation he had felt, the doubts, the struggles, and how all of that had led him to this point. And in that moment, he understood something. The journey wasn't about getting back to where he had been. It wasn't about reclaiming the perfect performances or the admiration of the world. It was about embracing the imperfections, the mistakes, the moments of doubt, and learning to find beauty in them. It was about playing not for the audience, but for himself, and in doing so, finding a deeper connection to the world around him. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to smile, knowing that the music he had found was something far more precious than any perfection he had once sought. It was real, it was honest, and it was enough. The journey was far from over, but for the first time he was no longer searching for something outside of himself. He had found it. The music, the peace, the connection, it was all within him, and now he was ready to share it with the world.